Hey folks, welcome back to week 12 of Visual Design. Now that we've gone through typography from a historical, structural, and psychological point of view, let's take a look at how typography works in Adobe Illustrator. So let's poke over to Adobe Illustrator here and just have a basic document set up. Okay, so there are numerous places in Illustrator where you can engage with typography. The first place you're going to start is with the Type tool over here in the toolbox. So the fourth tool down on the left, if you're doing the two-column toolbox, is in fact the Type tool. Now, when you click on the Type tool, it activates the type cursor. So you'll notice that your cursor has changed from a black arrow to that sort of typical type cursor that you see in all sorts of different programs like Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever. So that indicates that you can make some active typography. Now, underneath the Type tool, you'll see there's a little baby arrow. So if I press down on the Type tool, you'll see that there's a number of other adjacent type tools, such as the Area Type tool, Type on a Path, Vertical Type, etc., etc. We will get through those later on. We'll take a look at some of those as we go, but for now we're going to stick with just the basic Type tool. Now, there are two basic ways to work with the Type tool. The first one is, after you've chosen the tool, to simply bring your cursor over to your document and click once. Once you click once, you'll see that you get this blinking cursor that's happening over here, and that gives you a place to start typing. So here we can start typing. Okay, now once you start typing with the blinking cursor, it's very similar to working in, say, Microsoft Word. Now, this type of use of the Type tool does not have any restrictions in terms of boundaries or geography, meaning that if I were to just keep typing, it would just run on and on and on right off the page into the scratch space, and it would just keep going until I were to hit the return key and then start a new line. And so on and so forth. So that's one way to use the Type tool. You click once, you start typing, and that blinking cursor will remain at the end of what you've typed until you continue on. And again, similar to a word processing program like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, I can click anywhere and drag to highlight certain parts of it. I can move the blinking cursor anywhere by clicking into different places, and of course, I can copy and paste by highlighting certain things and then copying and placing it somewhere else like that. Now, in this way, it should be pretty familiar to you because if you've used any sort of word processing program, this basic way of typing is pretty straightforward. Now, once you're done, like everything else in Illustrator, go back to the black selection arrow, and that will shut off the blinking type cursor and just turn on a bounding box. Now, similar to other bounding box we have dealt with, this handles type in a similar fashion in that with the bounding box turned on, I can pick up what I just typed and move it somewhere else. That's easy enough. I can bring my cursor to the outside corner and get that double rounded arrow and rotate my type. So if I want to spin it around, put it at an angle, put it upside down, I can do that too. So it treats it pretty much like an object. If I were to grab one of the anchor points and click and drag it out, it changes the size of the font, right? It treats it like a shape, so I can make it larger or smaller. And if I'm holding down the Shift key, it will keep it proportionate, but if I don't hold the Shift key, I can squish the type like that. Now, I will tell you from a typography point of view, you don't squish type. It's a big no-no. It's one of those things that falls under the category of you can do it, but you should not do it. You know, type is designed a particular way. We talked about people who design typefaces, people who are known as fontographers, and so every letter form, every character is designed to look and feel a certain way, and they're also designed to interact with each other a certain way. And so therefore, by squishing them, either by making them, squished like this, or stretching them out vertically like this, you're basically sort of breaking that unwritten contract of how to deal with type. So don't squish type. It's generally a bad idea. So always hold down the Shift key so that you can resize it, but not squish it. And then, of course, the other item here is this tool, which allows you to changes the area of the type and changes the way it looks. So I can readjust that space that the type is living in. and then that allows me to drag out the type box and make it bigger. And now if I want to add type within that frame, I can. So it allows me to reset the type box itself. Now, speaking of type boxes, that brings me back to the second way that you can deal with type in Illustrator. Instead of clicking once and starting to type, go back to your type tool, and now you're going to click and drag out a pre-sized type box. Now this gives it a boundary, right? That blue frame gives it a boundary. So now if I start typing, you'll see that it will simply stay within the box, right? Now I'm not typing any words here, I'm just essentially making gobbledygook just to show you that as I keep typing, it will return itself automatically within the confines of that box. Now, you can also copy and paste type into these boxes if you have something sort of preset, like some lorem ipsum, like I happen to have here. I can simply make sure I have my blinking cursor inside the text box and then paste, and I can drop an entire paragraph in there. Now, if you don't know, lorem ipsum is basically placeholder text. It's fake text that designers use to simply hold the place until you get the actual text from somebody who's doing the writing for you. It gives you an opportunity to use text that looks like real words, acts like real words, but is not actual real words. So you can go ahead and set your type properly from there. So again, two ways to put type into Illustrator, either by clicking once and just starting to type, or by clicking and dragging out a predetermined text box. Now with the text box, the bounding box, when you go back to your black selection arrow, works a little differently. I can still pick it up and move it, so that's fine. But now when I grab an anchor point and resize it, instead of the type getting larger or smaller, the space that the type can live within gets larger and smaller. So as you can see, that paragraph of type is moving around inside different sized boxes. So I can make the actual box that it lives in larger or smaller. I can rotate the box, but I can't rotate the type. So now I'm rotating the box, and now you'll see the type is in more of a diamond shape. So the bounding box works a little differently for paragraph type than it does for individual lines of type. Okay. And if I make the text box too small to accommodate the amount of type that I have, look what happens. I'll make it too small. You get this little red box in the lower right corner that is basically warning you, hey, there's way more type inside this box than you can actually see. You need to make the box bigger. So I can make the box bigger so that I can see all of the type. Okay, so those are the two ways that you enter type into Illustrator. Now, other tools regarding type involve the styling of the type, the way it looks, the font choice, the size, etc., etc. So I'm going to start with this one here that we wrote out. And so you can duplicate just like you can with other objects, right? With the black selection arrow, make sure your bounding box is active, and option click drag. And so I'm going to do this a few times so that we can have different versions of the same phrase, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to change the way they look over here. Now we're going to go to the Properties palette, and we've seen the Properties palette before. Remember, that is that sort of golf caddy palette that will give you the different tools it thinks you need based on what you have selected over here. So I have this text box selected, and so it's giving me a bunch of type tools. It's giving me the standard transform tools like for other objects, plus the standard appearance tools. Now type is treated in terms of color like other objects. If I click on the fill and change the color, I can make the type blue like that, or green, or whatever, and that is a fill color. You can also add a stroke to color by choosing a stroke color this way. Give it sort of a red color. But you generally want to stay away from adding a stroke to text, because strokes will essentially encroach on the shape of the type and therefore make it look a little weird. As you can see, this green fill with a red stroke looks a little strange. Now there are ways to add strokes to type that make it look better, but I will show you that later when we get into more sort of special effects with type later on. So for now, generally just choose a fill color, and that'll be your type color, and don't worry about the stroke. Okay, you can also adjust the opacity of type just like any other object. If you want to make it somewhat transparent, you can do that so you can see through the type. So that is absolutely a thing. But really the type tools are down below here, starting with character and then down below we have paragraph. Now the character section gives you the choice of choosing your font. Now the default font in Illustrator is usually Myriad Pro, and if I click on the down arrow, you can see that there are a number of different fonts. Notice that just as I hover over them, they will change up here to give you a preview of what each font looks like as you go through them. So you can sort of see what your choices are. So if I want to switch from Myriad to Arial, I can just do that, and then once you find the one you want, hit click, and it embeds it, so now it's Arial. The other thing below the font choice, of course, is the type style or the font style. Now you're familiar with these because most of them, most typefaces come with regular, sometimes referred to as Roman, italic, bold, and then usually bold italic. Those are pretty standard. Now, a good rule of thumb for deciding if a typeface is well designed is by the number of font styles or type styles that come with it automatically. Now, having these basic ones, regular, italic, bold, and bold italic, is sort of the bare minimum. So if you have those, then it's a pretty well-designed font, and it gives you some options. But for instance, if we go back to Myriad Pro, where we were earlier, right? Go back and check that out. And if you're looking for a specific font, by the way, once you open up the font picker, you can just start typing the name of the font and it will show up. So for example, we can just go right to Myriad Pro by simply typing Myriad Pro, and there it is. Now, once that shows up, now let's see how many type styles came with Myriad Pro. You can see there's a bunch. We've got condensed, condensed italic, bold italic, bold condensed italic, regular italic, semi-bold, and so on and so forth. Generally, the more type styles or font styles that come with a font, the more well thought out that font is from whoever designed the font. And so therefore it means that it's a nicely designed font and will work well in most situations. The other reason you want to pick fonts that have a bunch of type styles is that it allows you to only work with one or two different fonts, because too many fonts make a document look a little confusing. But if for example, if we went with just Myriad Pro and had to design an entire poster for something, all these different type styles give you all these other versions of it. So really, it's like working with more than one font. But anyway, that's something we'll learn more about later. All right, below that is the font size or the type size. Now remember, type is measured in points. It's not measured in inches or pixels. It's measured in points, and so you can simply use the arrows to go up and down. You can type in a specific number that you want, if you want it to be a certain size, and you can use the pull-down menu, and there's a bunch of presets over here. Okay, next to the right of that we have leading. Now we discussed lead type earlier in the previous lecture. The name for leading comes from those blocks of lead type that worked inside the Gutenberg press that we talked about. They were made from lead. Unfortunately, this was before people found out that lead was a toxic metal, so lots of people who worked on those machines handled those lead blocks of type and probably got very sick. So the term leading refers to the space between lines of type, right? So as you can see here in the bounding box, there's that blue line underneath each line of type. That's your baseline, which we talked about when we talked about typographic anatomy. And so leading is measured from baseline to baseline. So notice what happens if I start to increase the leading, the lines get further apart from each other, right? And then if I decrease the leading, they get closer together to the point where I can actually make them overlap each other. Now, of course, you don't really want to do that for readability purposes, because once the letters start to sort of blend together, you can have some readability issues. But you can certainly have some fun with it and try to do some funky stuff. Now, if you go to the pull-down menu, you'll see that one of the choices is automatic. That is basically how the typeface was designed by whoever designed the typeface. That is what you call solid leading. It's automatic. It'll set it to whatever it's meant to be set at, which in this particular case is 43.2. Now there is a relationship between the font size and the leading size. So for example, if I change the font size to 21, you'll see that the automatic leading changes to 25.2. If I change the font size to 36, you'll see that it changes to 43.2. If I change it to 60, it changes to 72. So meaning that whatever the automatic letting size is in direct proportion to whatever your font size is. And again, you can change it manually. Okay, the next thing to change is we're going to go over here to the bottom right, and this is called letter spacing. Now, letter spacing is the horizontal space between each character. So if I start making that wider, you'll see that the letters get further away from each other. I guess you could say there's social distancing, right? They're getting farther and farther apart from each other. And of course you can go in the other direction and make them closer together, just like letting, until the point where they start going negative below 0, and they will start getting too close together and start overlapping like this. Now again, with the pull-down menu, you'll see that there is a variety of presets in the negative area and a bunch of presets in the positive area. Now some letter spacing helps sort of define the way the type looks. And same thing going in the reverse, which is called negative letter spacing. Sometimes you want to do that a little bit. But again, don't go too far where it becomes a jumble, and don't go too far where it's so far apart that you start to lose track of where the words begin and end. And the 0 point on the letting is again how the typeface was designed initially. That's how it generally looks. Now, why would you want to make these adjustments? Well, it gives you full control over how your words and your letters look. And sometimes you want to do it for emphasis, sometimes it's a visual look, etc., etc. Okay, next, below that is, of course, paragraph styling, which gives you a bunch of alignment adjustments, aligning left, aligning center, aligning right, and so on and so forth. But these are less useful for freestanding type like this and are more useful over here when we're dealing with paragraphs. So for example, this paragraph of fake type that we put in here is left aligned, meaning that the left side is straight, the right side is rough, which is referred to as the rag edge in typography. And if I were to make it center justified, you can see it does that, where both sides of the paragraph are ragged. And if I do right justified, now the right side is straight and the left side is ragged. There's other ones called force justification, which force both sides to be straight. This works sometimes, like it looks pretty good here, but in other cases you'll find that the spaces between certain letters get to be too large, and it looks like there's these big white gaps in between words. Those are called rivers, by the way. The big white spaces between words are referred to as rivers. And so you can see that there's a few different versions of force justification, like the fully justified one. You'll see that there's that massive space between here. So they're not all optimal, but they serve different purposes. For example, in newspapers, they always used left full justified because it's just easy to drop it in that way. So anyway, left justified, aligned left is the most common. Center alignment is probably the second most common. Right alignment is probably the third most common. And then the force justification is used in certain areas. Okay, now that gives you some basics for dealing with type and handling type. So what I want you guys to do, now that you have some basic type tools, is to play around with type, do different things with it, take some chances with it, and just sort of play around with the different tools here in the properties palette and see what you can do. Also, try to treat some letters as individual objects. Remember, if you grab the type tool and click once, you can just make a letter, right, as opposed to typing out a whole word, and then go back to your selection arrow. Now I have a freestanding letter. And if I do it again, I can make another letter. And if I do it again, I can make a third letter. And now you're probably wondering, why am I typing out one letter at a time? Well, because this allows you to really treat each letter as an individual object and do different things with them and sort of have some creative fun with them and do some interesting things such as this and lay them out in ways that sort of is interesting. So you can also treat each individual letter as an object or as a shape. So that's something to think about, right? Okay, so play around with these basic type tools. No real goal other than just to have some fun and play around with them. And we are going to have some upcoming type assignments. So get familiar with the type tools, and I will be back with lectures next week.